So thanks very, very much for inviting me to talk today about returns to the federal investment in graduate education. As most of you in this room probably know, the federal government supports a very large number of PhD students and postdoctoral fellows, either indirectly on faculty members' grants or directly in the form of fellowships or on trainee grants. And most of these people who the federal government is supporting are working in university labs, such as Alex Pine's lab at Berkeley. Here's a picture of Alex Pine in his lab, surrounded by the postdocs and graduate students who are working with him. Despite the really substantial investment the federal government makes in graduate training and postdoctoral training, we know very, very little about the return on this investment subsequent to training, especially for those going to work in industry. Now, to just give you some idea of the magnitudes involved, according to NSF's statistical office, each year the federal government is supporting around 70,000 graduate students on some kind of support. If you look at this graph, you see that the two departments that put in the most funding is HHS, or in other words, NIH, and NSF. But other departments such as DOD and DOE also are paying for graduate student education. This just shows you work we did for the Biomedical Workforce Committee in 2012, where we looked at trends in the support of graduate students in basic biomedical sciences. And you see a very, very large increase, the green line among people on a research assistantship, while the blue and red lines are pretty stable, and that's people being supported on fellowships or traineeship grants. The federal government also spends a lot on training postdocs. Now, it's very hard to get really accurate counts of postdocs, but one thing, and so this data always has to be considered an undercount because there's so many creative titles here. But for the people we can count, we know that approximately 25,000 of them are supported by federal funds, most of them on principal investigators research grants, as you see, the large red bar, or a few on fellowships and traineeship grants. Who's paying for this postdoc, for these 25,000? Well, NIH is the dominant institute that pays here, but also NSF supports a large number of postdocs. So with that for background, let's spend some time conceptualizing the returns to this federal investment. If you think about it, benefits to this training accrue while the trainees are working in the lab, but benefits also accrue when trainees leave and take a position. The kinds of benefits that are accruing while they're working in the lab, while they're being trained, is that they're engaged in research, some of which may end up in producing a patent, and through technology transfer at the university have broader economic effects. And of course, students and postdocs are very involved in the creation of knowledge that's embedded in articles that come out of research in the lab. In some work we did a few years ago, we looked at articles published in the journal Science that came out of a US university lab, and we found, if we just looked at the first author, in other words, the people who were doing the heavy lifting here, that 42% were postdocs, 30% were graduate students, 2% were either students or postdocs. We couldn't tell for sure. That means that 74% of the first authors are trainees, and most of these trainees are being supported by the federal government. Of course, benefits accrue post-training. And if the trainee goes to an academic position, I mean, that's fairly straightforward. It's just what we've already been talking about. The benefits are in the form of technology transfer, the creation of knowledge embedded in articles, and the training of new students. But many, many trainees also go to non-academic positions, some to R&D firms, others to non-R&D firms. And this is very important to think about because increasingly trainees are taking positions in industry. and many of these are in non-R&D firms. It turns out now that the academic appointment is in most fields the alternative track or the non-traditional track compared to other placements. One way of looking at this is, again, data we put together for the biomedical workforce study, in which we split people into 4 cohorts. The first panel on the left is people who've been out 1 to 5 years. The next panel is people who've been out 6 to 10, 11 to 20, and over 20. And then we look at where they were working by cohort between 93 and 2008. And here, the red line shows you the percent that are going into tenure track positions, and the green line shows you the percent that are going into non-academic, non-research positions. And the important thing to point out here is that the green line is increasing quite a bit. Increasingly, people are going into non-academic, non-research positions, and the red line, the percent going into tenure track positions, has been declining. Unfortunately, NSF doesn't put together this data for other disciplines very readily, but the one thing NSF does do is it shows you the percent of a cohort that is in a tenure or tenure track position 3 to 5 years after they've gotten their PhD. And this shows this for 5 fields, and it shows what's happened between 1993 and 2013. And you see a downward trend here for almost all of the fields, and in particular, the only field, math and stat, in which more than 15% of the new PhDs are in tenure track positions. So in other words, a very, very small percent are in tenure track positions now. And what are the ones who are not in tenure track positions doing? Well, a few of them, some of them are still postdocs, but many, many of them have gone to work in industry, and many of the ones who go to work in industry are in non-R&D firms. So for background, let's talk a little bit about quantifying the flows of highly trained firms and relating these to firm productivity. You can think of the fact that trainees provide skills and knowledge to firms. I just love this quote by Oppenheimer, who said once that the best way to send information is to wrap it up in a person. But to date, we've been very, very handicapped in understanding the relationship between placement and firm performance. And that's because we really have not had a ready way for tracking graduates who go to industry, most of whom neither publish nor patent, and that's been the traditional way that we have followed graduates over time. But we are making some progress here, and so I'd like to talk for a few minutes about the U-Metrics data project and tell you how this can be used. So, the challenge in the past has been to know the actual placement of students going to industry. We're now able to routinely know where students go by matching PhD records at the US Census Bureau. And a group of us recently demonstrated this with what you could think of as a proof of concept paper that was published in the journal Science. So our approach was to match U-Metrics data, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that data in just a minute, for 8 universities to census data. And our focus was on recent PhDs supported on grants while in graduate school. This was a real team effort led by Nick Zolas at Census and Julia Lane, the last author in this paper, appropriately, is the person who's been the driving force behind U-Metrics. And Bruce Weinberg has also played a large role there. So what is U-Metrics? Well, U-Metrics project collects administrative data from universities regarding research funding coming to the universities. And for any campus that is part of U-Metrics, all federal funding records are scraped. And some campuses agree to also include funding from private sources in the data that is shared. The data are then deposited at a research institute at the University of Michigan named IRIS, and Jason Owen Smith, a sociologist who I think many of you are familiar with, is the director of the project. Right now, 56 campuses have verbally committed to join IRIS in the U-Metrics effort, and these campuses do over $25 billion in R&D. That's about 36% of the total R&D going on at universities right now. It's a nice mix of public and private institutions located in 21 states. Of those 56, 25 have actually executed the MOU, and the rest are in the process of executing it. So this proof of concept paper that I told you about uses data for 8 universities. They're all Midwestern universities. They're all public. And what we did is we scrape off the names of graduate students supported on grants. And then using the ProQuest data, we determine if they received a PhD by matching their names to ProQuest, as I said. This matches individual records. What we did was for those who had gotten their PhD between 2010 and 2012. And it's much easier to do this match and get a good match if you know the actual date of birth of the student or the approximate date of birth. And after doing this, we matched close to 2,000 students, 1,983 to be exact. How did we know where they went? Well, we matched them with business register data, which is a universe of U.S. non-agricultural firms and associated establishments, and we also use the longitudinal business database. Just to show you what we found, this is just the first cut. We found that 20% of them were going to R&D establishments. That's the blue bar. And the red bars here are the underlying benchmark in the United States. So 20% of these new PhDs go to R&D establishments. Just slightly more, 21% go to non-R&D establishments. 50% went to academia, and we assume many of those are postdoc positions, particularly after we observe the salary they're earning in them, and 7% went to government. So what kind of firms do the people who go to firms work at? Well, the green bars here show you the employment outcomes for our PhD students. And in the left, it shows you establishment employment or establishment size. So you see these are the means. The dash bar is a median. So we see that the PhD students, those in green, are employed in much larger firms. And they're much larger firms than if we just look at all R&D establishments, which are considerably smaller, that in red, or all US establishments, which are in blue. And then we can look at payroll per worker, and we see that the PhD students are working in establishments that have much higher payroll per worker than other firms in the US. If you look at the payroll distribution of where they're working, green bars here are our PhDs, and you see that it's very skewed to the right. And that's compared to all US establishments in blue or all US R&D establishments in red. Just to talk briefly about some other data, if you look at the bars on the last two panels on the right, we see that they're very much employed in high-wage firms, and high wage is defined as a firm that's paying above the median. So consistently, more than 50% of these PhDs who go to industry are going to high-wage firms. But if we look at the age, they're not going to particularly young firms. Very few of them go to firms that are under 5 years. So we can really broaden this. Our current goal is to do this for all U-Metric institutions, but there's no reason the analysis could not be done for all PhDs in the US. And one of the first ways to go about doing that would be to match the survey of earned doctorates with data at the US Census Bureau. And that would certainly be consistent, I'll add, with the Ryan-Murray Act. There are just lots of opportunities here if we do this. Opportunities to understand the patterns of innovation missed by R&D data. We can begin to start to model how knowledge stocks embedded in human capital contribute to innovation and firm performance. And we can examine other research questions, such as how the type of support relates to employment outcomes of PhDs, Are fellowships better? Training grants better? We can look at the role of social networks in placement, networks between universities and firms, and networks across firms. In theory, we can do exactly the same thing for postdoctoral fellows. The only trick here that's a little bit more challenging because postdoctoral fellows have so many different titles associated with them. So identifying them is hard. And of course, as you all know, matching data is not limited to U-metrics. There are a remarkable number of opportunities out there. And just to close, let me talk just very briefly, make a kind of advertisement for a project that Reinhilde Bulliger and I are working on that's with support from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. We're organizing a workshop to investigate the possibility of creating a data warehouse that contains information on individuals nominated for fellowships, both in the federal sector and the nonprofit sector, with the goal of linking this data to census data as other data and other databases. And if you're interested, please send either myself or Reinhilde an email and we'll follow up with you. So let me just say in closing, it's been a pleasure to talk about this today, and I'm very sorry I can't be here with you in person.